There are moments when a single sentence changes everything. A crowded diner. A quiet morning. Coffee cups clinking against saucers. The low murmur of conversations drifting across the room. Nothing about that day seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that within minutes, an entire town would be forced to confront a truth many had spent years avoiding. Then the sheriff walked in. People noticed him immediately. In a place like this, they always did. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every inch of the county line. Some respected him. Others simply stayed out of his way. Either way, when he entered a room, attention followed. On that morning, his attention landed on a stranger. The man sat alone near the window, stirring a cup of coffee he had barely touched. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't speaking loudly. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. Yet something about him seemed to bother the sheriff the moment their eyes met. The room grew quieter. Customers exchanged cautious glances. The sheriff approached the table. The stranger remained seated. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the sheriff broke the silence. "Not in my town. Not today." The words cut through the diner like a blade. Several customers stopped eating. A waitress froze beside the counter. Even the cook looked up from the grill. The stranger never raised his voice. He never stood from his chair. He simply looked up and listened. The sheriff pointed toward the front door. What happened next would become the subject of conversations throughout the county for months. Because while everyone in that diner believed they understood exactly what they were witnessing, almost nobody knew who the stranger really was. And nobody knew why he had come to town. The sheriff continued speaking. His voice grew louder. His confidence seemed unshakable. Each sentence carried the certainty of a man convinced he was in complete control. Then something happened. A waitress emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray loaded with plates. She glanced toward the stranger's table. At first, she kept walking. Then she noticed something clipped inside his jacket. Her expression changed instantly. She stopped. Her eyes widened. The tray slipped from her hands. Porcelain shattered across the floor. The crash echoed through the diner. Every head turned. For the first time that morning, the sheriff looked uncertain. Because whatever the waitress had seen, it was enough to drain the color from her face. And within seconds, it would begin changing the course of the entire confrontation. Who was the stranger? Why had he traveled hundreds of miles to reach this small town? What had the waitress recognized that everyone else missed? And why would the sheriff soon wish he could take back every word he had just spoken? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The answers to those questions didn't begin inside that diner. They began months earlier, long before the shattered plates, long before the confrontation, long before anyone realized that one quiet visitor was about to uncover secrets that many people believed would remain hidden forever. To understand what really happened that morning, we first have to understand the town itself. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people trusted immediately. Tree-lined streets, family-owned businesses, Friday night football games. The sort of community where people waved at one another from passing trucks and where everybody seemed to know everybody else. But appearances can be misleading. Beneath the friendly smiles and familiar routines were stories rarely discussed in public. Stories shared quietly between neighbors. Stories repeated behind closed doors. Stories that often began with the same name. And over time, those stories would attract attention from people far beyond the county line. People who had started asking questions. People searching for answers. And one of those people was the stranger sitting quietly in that diner. The shattered plates had been cleaned up within minutes, but the silence they left behind lingered much longer. Nobody in the diner seemed eager to return to their conversations. The waitress who had dropped the tray kept glancing toward the stranger's table, her hands trembling each time she reached for another coffee pot. The sheriff noticed it too. Whatever confidence he had displayed moments earlier was beginning to crack, replaced by something far less comfortable. Suspicion, uncertainty, questions he couldn't answer. The stranger remained calm. He hadn't argued. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't even raised his voice. Yet somehow, his presence alone had managed to change the atmosphere of the entire room. And that raised a question no one could ignore. Why had the sheriff targeted him in the first place? The stranger had done nothing wrong. He had walked into the diner, ordered coffee, and kept to himself. Yet from the moment the sheriff spotted him, the confrontation seemed almost inevitable. It wasn't the behavior of a lawman responding to a disturbance. It felt personal, as though the sheriff had seen something that immediately made him uncomfortable. But what? What could a quiet stranger sitting alone in a roadside diner possibly have done to provoke such a reaction? The customers wondered. The waitress wondered. And somewhere deep inside his own mind, the sheriff was beginning to wonder whether he had made a mistake. Then there was the question of the jacket. Several people in the diner had noticed the stranger wearing it. Nothing flashy, nothing unusual, just a dark jacket that blended in with the rest of his appearance. Yet hidden beneath, it was something powerful enough to make the waitress drop an entire tray of dishes. What had she seen? The answer seemed obvious to her. The moment her eyes landed on it, all color disappeared from her face. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. She knew exactly what she was looking at. The problem was that nobody else did. And the more the sheriff thought about it, the more that uncertainty began to spread through him as well. Because if the stranger was exactly who he appeared to be, none of this made sense. But if he wasn't, then everything changed. Meanwhile, another question hung over the diner like a storm cloud waiting to break. Why had the stranger come to town? Small towns receive visitors every day. Travelers stop for gas. Tourists pass through. Salesmen check into motels and leave by morning. But there was something different about this man. The way he observed people. The way he listened. The way his eyes seemed to study every detail around him. It wasn't the behavior of someone passing through. It was the behavior of someone searching for something. Or someone. The truth was, his arrival wasn't random. Hundreds of miles away, events had already been set into motion long before he stepped through the diner's front door. Phone calls had been made. Reports had been reviewed. Names had appeared repeatedly in documents. Patterns had emerged. And eventually, all of those roads led to this town. A town that looked peaceful from the outside. A town where people smiled in public. A town where most residents avoided discussing certain subjects after dark. Because over the years, stories had accumulated. Stories that sounded different on the surface, but shared familiar details underneath. People being treated unfairly. Complaints disappearing. Questions left unanswered. Residents learning it was safer to stay quiet than to speak openly. None of it seemed connected at first, until someone started connecting the pieces. And once that process began, it became impossible to stop. The stranger sitting quietly in the diner wasn't there because he happened to be traveling through the area. He wasn't there for breakfast. He wasn't there to admire the scenery. He had come looking for answers. Answers buried beneath years of silence. Answers hidden behind official reports and carefully crafted explanations. Answers that somebody had worked very hard to keep from reaching the public. The sheriff didn't know that yet. The customers didn't know that yet. Even the waitress only understood a small part of the truth. But the closer the stranger moved toward those answers, the more dangerous the situation became. Because whenever long-buried secrets are threatened, people become desperate. And desperate people often make mistakes. The confrontation inside the diner was only the beginning. The real story was still waiting to unfold. And before this day was over, the entire town would discover that the stranger's arrival had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. To understand why the confrontation inside the diner felt so significant, you first have to understand the sheriff. For more than 20 years, he had been one of the most powerful men in the county. New businesses opened with his approval. Community events often featured him as a guest of honor. Politicians sought his endorsement during election season. To many residents, he represented stability. The familiar face people saw during parades, football games, and town celebrations. Parents trusted him. Business owners respected him. Visitors often heard glowing descriptions of the man before they ever met him. But that wasn't the entire story. In quiet conversations held away from public gatherings, a different version of the sheriff emerged. It was a version rarely discussed openly. People lowered their voices when speaking about it. Some refused to speak about it at all. Over the years, rumors circulated throughout the county. Complaints appeared and disappeared. Stories spread from neighbor to neighbor. Accounts of confrontations. Claims of intimidation. Allegations that certain residents received very different treatment depending on who they were and where they came from. Yet somehow, nothing ever seemed to happen. No matter how serious the accusations became, they always faded away. Investigations stalled. Witnesses changed their minds. Paperwork vanished. And eventually people learned a lesson. Keeping quiet was easier. Because at the end of the day, he was the sheriff. The man wore the badge. The man controlled the narrative. The man knew almost everyone in town. And perhaps more importantly, almost everyone knew him. As years passed, one phrase became closely associated with his reputation. People repeated it in barbershops. They repeated it at gas stations. They repeated it around backyard cookouts. My town. My rules. Some heard confidence in those words. Others heard a warning. Either way, the phrase followed him everywhere. And on that morning inside the diner, it was the exact phrase he had used moments before the waitress dropped her tray. What nobody realized was that those words were about to carry consequences far beyond anything the sheriff expected. Meanwhile, the stranger sitting quietly near the window remained a mystery. Unlike the sheriff, very little was known about him. He had arrived before sunrise, entering town while most residents were still asleep. Security cameras would later show him stopping briefly at a gas station before continuing toward the diner. He wasn't carrying luggage. He wasn't asking for directions. He wasn't taking photographs like a tourist. Instead, he seemed focused, purposeful, almost as if every step had been carefully planned long before he arrived. Witnesses later remembered how well-dressed he appeared that morning. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive enough to attract attention. Just neat, professional clothing and the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was supposed to be. The waitress remembered him clearly. She recalled how polite he had been when ordering coffee, how he thanked her, how he spent more time observing the room than drinking from his cup. Several customers would later describe the same thing. The stranger watched everything, not in a threatening way, not in a nervous way, in a deliberate way. He noticed who entered the diner, who greeted whom, which conversations suddenly stopped when certain people walked into the room. The longer he sat there, the more it seemed he was collecting information. Small details most people would ignore. Expressions, reactions, patterns. And every few minutes, he would quietly jot something down. That behavior raised questions. Because tourists don't usually take notes. Travelers passing through don't spend their mornings studying strangers. People looking for breakfast don't carefully observe an entire room before touching their food. The stranger was doing something. The question was what? And why? What made the mystery even more intriguing was how calm he remained during the confrontation. Most people placed in that situation would have reacted emotionally. Some would have argued. Others would have left. A few might have lost their temper. The stranger did none of those things. Even when the sheriff challenged him. Even when customers stared. Even when the tension became impossible to ignore. He remained composed. As though he had anticipated the confrontation long before it happened. As though the sheriff's reaction had confirmed something he already suspected. That possibility became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Because if the stranger truly expected this encounter, then perhaps his presence in town was connected to the sheriff in ways nobody yet understood. And if that was true, the events unfolding inside the diner were no accident. They were part of something larger. Something that had begun long before breakfast was served. Something that had quietly been moving toward this town for months. The customers didn't know it. The waitress didn't fully understand it. And the sheriff certainly hadn't realized it when he first approached the stranger's table. But the answers they were all searching for were getting closer. And before this day ended, the mystery surrounding the stranger would become impossible to ignore. As the morning continued, the mystery surrounding the stranger only deepened. Most people who stopped at the diner came for breakfast and conversation. They checked their phones, chatted with friends, and hurried off to work. The stranger did none of those things. He remained focused on the world around him, as though every minute spent inside the diner served a purpose. Then his phone rang. The sound was quiet, but in the growing silence of the room, several nearby customers noticed him answer immediately. His voice remained calm, measured, professional. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. For the first few moments, nobody paid much attention. But then a customer seated in the next booth began overhearing fragments of the conversation. Not complete sentences, just pieces, enough to raise questions. The stranger mentioned documents, then evidence. A few moments later, he mentioned reports. His tone never changed. There was no excitement in his voice, no emotion, only the calm certainty of someone discussing important information. The customer listened closely, hoping to hear more. But the stranger seemed experienced at protecting details. Whenever the conversation approached something specific, his voice dropped lower. Names became impossible to hear. Locations remained unclear. Every answer seemed hidden inside another question. By the time the call ended, the nearby customer knew only one thing for certain. The stranger wasn't discussing business. He wasn't arranging travel plans. And he certainly wasn't talking about breakfast. Whatever brought him to town appeared connected to something much larger. Something official. Something serious. The stranger slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the stack of papers resting beside his coffee cup. That was when the waitress noticed them. At first glance, the documents appeared ordinary. Several sheets of paper. A folder. A notebook. Nothing unusual. But as she moved between tables, delivering coffee refills and collecting empty plates, she caught brief glimpses of what the stranger was reviewing. Names. Dates. Photographs. Typed reports. Highlighted sections. Notes written neatly in the margins. The waitress wasn't close enough to read everything, but she could tell these weren't random papers. Someone had spent considerable time organizing them. The pages appeared detailed, methodical, important. The stranger occasionally flipped back through earlier sections, comparing information before writing another note. It looked less like reading and more like an investigation. That realization unsettled her. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she found herself watching him more closely. And the more she watched, the more uncomfortable she became. Not because he appeared dangerous. In fact, it was the opposite. The stranger seemed completely in control, completely prepared, as though he already knew exactly what he was looking for. Meanwhile, other customers began noticing him too. Whispers spread quietly through the diner. People exchanged curious glances. Speculation grew. Who was he? Why was he taking notes? What information was hidden inside those files? No one had answers, but the questions continued multiplying. Then the front door opened. Everything changed. The reaction was immediate. A few customers stopped talking mid-sentence. Several people lowered their eyes toward their plates. Others suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. The shift was impossible to miss. Even the stranger noticed it. Without turning his head, he seemed aware that something significant had just happened, because the sheriff had arrived. The atmosphere inside the diner transformed within seconds. Not because anyone announced his presence. Not because he demanded attention. The reaction came naturally, almost instinctively. People adjusted their behavior the moment he walked through the door. Years of habit had taught them to do exactly that. The sheriff greeted a few familiar faces as he entered. Most responded politely. Some forced smiles. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The stranger quietly observed every reaction, every expression, every uncomfortable glance, every sign of tension. And the more he watched, the more interested he seemed. Near the counter, the waitress suddenly looked nervous. Far more nervous than she had been moments earlier. She glanced toward the sheriff, then toward the stranger, then back toward the sheriff again. Something about seeing both men inside the same room appeared to trouble her. Her hands moved more quickly. Her breathing became slightly uneven. Several times she appeared ready to say something before stopping herself. Why? What was she thinking? What did she know? Those questions remained unanswered. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The waitress recognized something that most people in the diner did not. Whether it involved the stranger, the sheriff, or the documents spread across that table, she understood enough to know that trouble was coming. And as the sheriff slowly made his way across the diner floor, moving closer and closer to the stranger's table, the sense of anticipation became impossible to ignore. The stranger closed the folder. The sheriff stopped beside the table. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The customers watched. The waitress froze. And without realizing it, everyone inside the diner had become witnesses to the moment when two very different stories were about to collide. A collision that would expose secrets nobody expected, and a confrontation that neither man would ever forget. The moment the sheriff stopped beside the stranger's table, the tension that had been quietly building throughout the morning finally reached the surface. Conversations faded. Coffee cups paused halfway to people's lips. The waitress stopped moving for a brief second before forcing herself back to work. Everyone sensed it. Something important was about to happen. The sheriff stood over the stranger and studied him carefully. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The stranger remained seated, calm and composed, while the sheriff seemed determined to establish control before a single question had even been asked. Finally, the sheriff broke the silence. "Where are you from?" The question sounded simple enough. The stranger looked up. His expression never changed. He calmly gave a short answer. The sheriff nodded slightly. Then came another question. "What brings you here?" Again, the stranger responded politely. Nothing about his answer appeared disrespectful. Nothing appeared threatening. Yet with every response, the sheriff seemed to grow more uncomfortable. Nearby customers exchanged glances. The interaction felt unusual. Most people in town became nervous when the sheriff questioned them. The stranger wasn't nervous at all. That confidence appeared to bother the sheriff more than anything else. A third question followed. "Who do you work for?" This time the stranger paused. Only for a moment, just long enough for several people nearby to notice. Then he offered another careful response. Not evasive, not argumentative, simply measured. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Whatever answer he had expected, it clearly wasn't the one he received. The atmosphere inside the diner continued tightening. Even customers sitting on the far side of the room found themselves listening. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. The sheriff's voice became louder. No longer a conversation. No longer casual questioning. It was beginning to sound like a challenge. The stranger remained calm. He never raised his voice. He never stood from his chair. He simply listened and answered when necessary. That only seemed to make the sheriff angrier. As the exchange continued, several customers quietly reached for their phones. Some pretended to check messages. Others lowered their screens beneath the tables. But their cameras were recording. Years of living in the town had taught them something important. When tensions involving the sheriff started rising, it was wise to keep a record. The sheriff either didn't notice or didn't care. His attention remained fixed on the stranger. Every answer appeared to create more questions. Every question seemed to increase his frustration. Then came the phrase everyone in town knew by heart. The phrase that had followed him for years. The phrase repeated countless times in whispered conversations throughout the county. My town. My rules. The words landed heavily inside the silent diner. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because everyone knew what those words usually meant. They meant the discussion was over. The decision had already been made. And challenging that decision rarely ended well. The sheriff pointed toward the front door. His message was clear. Leave. Now. Several customers looked toward the stranger. Most expected him to stand up and walk away. Others expected an argument. A few feared something worse. Instead, the stranger calmly took another sip of coffee. Then he politely refused. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Legally. Respectfully. He explained that he had broken no laws. He had paid for his meal. He was causing no disturbance. And he intended to remain where he was. The response stunned the room. People weren't accustomed to seeing someone challenge the sheriff so calmly. Especially not in public. Especially not inside a diner filled with witnesses. The sheriff's expression hardened immediately. His patience appeared to disappear. The volume of his voice increased. His posture became more confrontational. The questions stopped. Demands took their place. Customers shifted nervously in their seats. Several stopped pretending they weren't watching. Now everyone was openly focused on the confrontation. The waitress felt her stomach tighten. Something about the encounter seemed wrong. Very wrong. She had witnessed disagreements before. She had seen the sheriff remove people from businesses. But this felt different. The stranger wasn't acting like someone caught off guard. He wasn't acting like someone trapped. If anything, he seemed almost prepared. As though every word spoken by the sheriff was confirming something he already suspected. That realization unsettled her. She picked up a tray loaded with plates and began moving toward another section of the diner. But her attention kept drifting back toward the stranger, toward his jacket, toward the folder resting beside him, toward the calm confidence he continued displaying despite the growing pressure. Then she saw it. Just for a second, the stranger shifted slightly in his chair. The edge of his jacket moved. Something clipped inside became visible. The waitress froze. Her eyes locked onto it instantly. At first, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then recognition hit. The color drained from her face. The tray slipped from her fingers. Plates crashed against the floor. The sound exploded through the diner. Porcelain shattered in every direction. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The sheriff looked toward the waitress. The customers looked toward the waitress. Even the stranger slowly lifted his eyes. Nobody understood what had happened. But the waitress did. She knew exactly what she had seen. And judging by the fear spreading across her face, it was something powerful enough to change everything. The room fell completely silent. The sheriff's confidence began to fade. The stranger remained calm. And suddenly, one question became more important than every other question in the diner. What exactly had the waitress seen hidden beneath that jacket? For several long seconds after the plate shattered, nobody moved. The sound of breaking porcelain had faded, but the shock remained frozen across every face in the diner. The waitress stood motionless. Her breathing had become shallow. Her eyes remained fixed on the stranger, not on his face, not on the folder resting beside his coffee, on the badge she had glimpsed beneath his jacket. She knew exactly what she had seen, and that knowledge terrified her. It wasn't a local badge. It wasn't connected to the county. It wasn't state police. It belonged to something far larger, something with authority that extended far beyond the sheriff's jurisdiction. The realization hit her like a wave. Suddenly, the confrontation unfolding in front of everyone looked completely different. This wasn't a traveler arguing with a sheriff. This wasn't a visitor refusing to leave a diner. This was something else entirely. Something much bigger than anyone in the room had imagined. The sheriff noticed the change in her expression immediately. He looked from the waitress to the stranger and then back again. A trace of uncertainty crossed his face. The customers noticed it too. Many of them had known the sheriff for years. Some had known him for decades. They had seen him angry, confident, demanding, even intimidating. But uncertainty was something few had ever witnessed. And for the first time that day, uncertainty was exactly what appeared in his eyes. The stranger slowly pushed his chair back. The movement was calm, deliberate. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt. The entire diner watched as he stood to his full height. The sheriff remained silent. The customers remained silent. Even the waitress seemed afraid to breathe. Then the stranger reached into his jacket. Several people immediately tensed. The sheriff instinctively shifted his stance. But the stranger's movements remained controlled, measured, professional. A moment later, he removed a leather identification holder and opened it. The room seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff looked down. His eyes locked onto the credentials. Everything changed. The confidence that had carried him through the confrontation vanished. The authority in his posture weakened. The certainty disappeared. For the first time since entering the diner, the sheriff had no response. No command. No threat. No argument. He simply stared, speechless. The customers exchanged confused looks. Most couldn't see the identification clearly enough to understand what it said, but they didn't need to. The sheriff's reaction told them everything. Whatever was written inside that credential had immediately shifted the balance of power. The stranger allowed a few seconds to pass before finally speaking. His voice remained calm. The same calm voice he had used throughout the morning. The same calm voice he had used during the phone call. The same calm voice he had used while answering every question the sheriff had thrown at him. Then he revealed the truth. He was part of a federal civil rights investigation. The words landed heavily inside the diner. Several customers stared in disbelief. Others looked directly at the sheriff. The waitress closed her eyes briefly as if a suspicion she had been carrying for months had finally been confirmed. The stranger continued. The town had been under review for months. Reports had been collected. Complaints had been examined. Witness statements had been gathered. Records had been reviewed. Patterns had emerged. And those patterns had pointed investigators directly toward this community. The sheriff said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. The stranger explained that his visit to the diner had not been random. He hadn't chosen the location by chance. He hadn't stopped for breakfast simply because he was hungry. The diner represented the final piece of a much larger puzzle. A place where investigators believed they could observe interactions naturally. A place where people behaved the way they always behaved, without realizing they were being watched, without realizing they were being evaluated, without realizing they might be revealing far more than they intended. A wave of shock moved through the room. The customers looked at one another. The implications were enormous. Because if the stranger was telling the truth, then this morning's confrontation had unfolded exactly as investigators hoped it would. Every word, every reaction, every decision, all of it mattered. The silence that followed felt different from the silence earlier. Before, people had been afraid to speak. Now they were deciding whether they finally should. One customer glanced toward another. A retired mechanic slowly stood from his booth. He looked at the stranger, then at the sheriff, then back at the stranger again. For a moment, it seemed he might sit back down. Instead, he spoke. His voice shook slightly, but he spoke. And once he did, something remarkable happened. Others began speaking too. quietly at first, then more openly. A woman near the counter mentioned an incident she had witnessed years earlier. A truck driver recalled a traffic stop that had never felt right. Another customer described a complaint that had gone nowhere. The stories weren't identical, but they shared similarities. Too many similarities. Enough to make people uncomfortable. Enough to make people wonder whether what they had dismissed as isolated incidents were actually connected. The stranger listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply listened and occasionally wrote notes. More customers found the courage to speak. Stories that had remained buried for years slowly emerged into the open. Accounts of intimidation, threats, unexplained treatment, questions that never received answers. Situations people had convinced themselves were better forgotten. Yet now, with federal credentials sitting openly on the table, those memories no longer felt impossible to discuss. The sheriff remained unusually quiet, and the longer he stayed silent, the more willing people became to share what they knew. What had started as a confrontation inside a diner was becoming something entirely different, something nobody had anticipated. For years, fear had kept many of these stories hidden. For years, people had assumed nothing would ever change. But standing inside that diner, listening to voices that had remained silent for far too long, it suddenly became clear that the stranger's arrival had accomplished something no one thought possible. People were finally talking. And once the truth begins finding its voice, it becomes very difficult to silence again. As more voices filled the diner, the stranger's notebook began collecting something far more valuable than observations. It was collecting confirmation. For months, investigators had been assembling pieces of a puzzle that never seemed complete. Individual complaints existed. Witness accounts existed. Official reports existed. Yet each piece alone could be dismissed as a misunderstanding, an isolated incident, or a simple disagreement. What investigators needed was a pattern, and patterns only emerge when enough pieces are placed together. Now, sitting inside that diner, the stranger was watching those pieces connect in real time. One customer described an encounter from years earlier. Another remembered a complaint that had quietly disappeared. A third recalled witnessing behavior that never seemed appropriate but was never officially questioned. Individually, the stories sounded different. Together, they painted a picture the sheriff was beginning to recognize. And judging by the growing concern on his face, he understood exactly where that picture was leading. The stranger calmly opened the folder that had been sitting beside his coffee throughout the morning. For the first time, several customers could see just how extensive its contents really were. Pages filled with notes, statements, timelines, photographs, official documents. The same materials the waitress had glimpsed earlier. The same materials that had convinced her this situation was far bigger than anyone realized. The sheriff stared at the folder. His eyes moved across the pages. And with every passing second, his expression became more difficult to hide. Because much of what he was seeing wasn't new information. He recognized some of it immediately. Names, dates, incidents, moments he likely believed had been forgotten long ago. The stranger then revealed something that sent another wave of shock through the room. Investigators had spent months reviewing body camera footage connected to multiple encounters throughout the county. Hours upon hours of recordings, traffic stops, public interactions, routine calls, moments that appeared ordinary until examined carefully. Investigators had compared reports against recordings, statements against footage, explanations against evidence. And according to the stranger, the discrepancies had become impossible to ignore. Several customers exchanged nervous glances. The waitress stopped what she was doing and listened. Even those who had remained skeptical throughout the morning suddenly found themselves paying closer attention. Because this was no longer based on rumors. This was evidence. The stranger continued. Witness statements had been collected. Official complaints had been reviewed. Past allegations had been compared against newly discovered information. Each review added another piece to the investigation. Each witness strengthened the picture investigators were building. And then came the realization that visibly shook the sheriff. This morning's confrontation had not simply been witnessed. It had been documented. The customers who had quietly pulled out their phones earlier weren't the only ones recording. The stranger informed him that investigators had anticipated the possibility of exactly this kind of encounter. Everything that happened inside the diner mattered. Every question, every command, every reaction. Every word spoken in front of dozens of witnesses. Captured, preserved, recorded. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. For a moment, it looked as though he wanted to respond, to challenge the claim, to regain control of the situation. But no response came, because deep down, he understood the problem. The evidence wasn't based on secondhand stories anymore. It wasn't dependent on faded memories. It wasn't hidden inside rumors passed between neighbors. It existed in recordings, footage, documents, statements, a growing collection of facts that could be reviewed again and again. The same authority the sheriff had relied upon for decades suddenly seemed less powerful than it had only an hour earlier. The room could feel it. Everyone could feel it. The balance had shifted. For years, many residents believed the sheriff held all the power. He decided which complaints mattered. He decided which stories deserved attention. He decided who people believed. Now that certainty was disappearing, because the process had reversed. The man who spent years questioning others was suddenly being questioned himself. The man accustomed to controlling investigations had become the focus of one. The man who entered the diner expecting to assert authority now found himself standing before evidence he could neither dismiss nor silence. The transformation was impossible to miss. Earlier that morning, customers avoided eye contact with the sheriff. Now they watched him carefully. Earlier that morning, people hesitated to speak. Now they found the courage to share what they knew. Earlier that morning, the stranger appeared alone. Now he appeared supported by something far larger than anyone in the diner had imagined. The sheriff looked around the room. At the customers. At the waitress. At the phones. At the witnesses. At the folder filled with evidence. And perhaps for the first time that day, he understood the reality of the situation. This wasn't a confrontation he could simply end with a command. This wasn't a problem that would disappear when people went home. The encounter he believed would reinforce his authority had done the exact opposite. It had exposed it. The words "my town, my rules" no longer carried the weight they had only an hour earlier. Because the rules had changed. The power dynamic had changed. And standing in the middle of that crowded diner, surrounded by witnesses and evidence, the sheriff found himself facing a reality he never expected. The hunter had become the hunted, and the investigation was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, the town changed in ways many residents never thought possible. For years, conversations had ended before they truly began. Questions were left unasked. Concerns were shared only with trusted friends behind closed doors. People learned to keep their heads down, avoid attention, and move on with their lives. Whether those fears were justified or simply reinforced by years of silence, the result was the same. Few people believed their voices could make a difference. That belief began to change. As investigators continued their work, more residents stepped forward. Some provided statements. Others shared documents they had kept tucked away for years. A few offered details about incidents they had never discussed publicly before. One story led to another. One witness encouraged the next. And slowly, the silence that had protected so many unanswered questions started disappearing. The sheriff found himself facing something he had spent most of his career avoiding. Accountability. Not accusations whispered across town. Not rumors exchanged over coffee. Questions. Direct questions. Questions supported by statements, records, and evidence. Questions that demanded answers. And for the first time in a very long time, those questions weren't going away. The customers who had witnessed the confrontation inside the diner often spoke about that morning afterward. Some remembered the exact moment the sheriff's confidence began to fade. Others remembered the crash of the plates hitting the floor. Many remembered the silence that followed when the stranger revealed who he really was. But perhaps the most memorable part wasn't the confrontation itself. It was what happened afterward. People began talking. Openly. Honestly. Without looking over their shoulders first. The waitress would later admit that she knew something unusual was happening the moment she recognized the badge beneath the stranger's jacket. Even then, she couldn't have imagined how much would change because of a single glance across a crowded diner. As for the stranger, his purpose had never been what anyone assumed. He wasn't there for breakfast. He wasn't passing through. He wasn't searching for an argument. He came looking for answers. He came looking for facts. He came looking for the truth. And on that morning, the truth revealed far more than anyone expected. The diner had simply been the place where years of unanswered questions finally collided with accountability. A place where confidence met evidence. A place where silence met courage. A place where people who had spent years watching suddenly decided it was time to speak. And maybe that's why stories like this continue to resonate long after the headlines fade. Because they remind us of something important. Power can silence people for a while. It can discourage questions. It can create fear. It can convince ordinary people that speaking up won't matter. But eventually, the truth finds its way into the light. And when it does, no badge, title, position, or reputation can stop it forever. The real question is not whether the truth eventually emerges. The real question is how many opportunities are lost while people wait for someone else to speak first. So what do you think? Was justice finally served? Or did this town wait too long to speak up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next powerful documentary-style investigation.